All right, so I want to welcome everybody again to the Civics Project, and today our focus for today is on the executive branch. I want to begin with a land acknowledgement. But first, I'm Beth Rebay, and I'm the Director of Repair and the host of the Civics Project, although on various occasions in future, we will have some wonderful guest hosts. And I want to start, as noted, with a land acknowledgement. Repair acknowledges the Tongva peoples as the traditional land caretakers of Tuvangar, the Los Angeles Basin and South Channel Islands. And we are grateful to have the opportunity to work for the Tarahatom, the indigenous peoples in this place. We pay our respects to Hanukvatam, the ancestors, Ahihiram, elders, and Iohinkem, our relatives and relations, past, present, and emerging. So as noted, the focus of today's session is on the executive branch in the United States. And I'm going to focus initially on US history, and then we'll move a bit into contemporary powers of the presidency and talk about executive orders. So one of the foundational responsibilities that US presidents embraced from the outset involved the conquest of land and control of as much as possible the North American continent. And this colonial project was predicated on the domination and, in some cases, elimination of indigenous peoples. In making sense of the roots and foundations that have created our contemporary US presidencies and what they might mean to us today, we have to go ahead and confront the historical context of presidency in the United States. And it's a difficult history, but I think an important one, especially in making sense of contemporary problems in the executive branch. The Iroquois Confederacy, composed of 6 member nations, gave a name to George Washington, which was Conotocarius, which translated to town destroyer. And some indigenous communities continue to use the term to refer to presidents in the United States. In other words, in several indigenous languages, now there's a word for president that translates to town destroyer. In order to understand a little bit of the and I want to disclaim, I don't think we can fully comprehend these kinds of events either from the perspective of people in the 18th century or specifically indigenous peoples in that time. But I'm going to share a little bit of a letter written in 1790 to President Washington, who by that time was the first president of the United States, from 3 Seneca chiefs. The chiefs were Big Tree, Corn Planter, and Halftown. And they wrote to George Washington to appeal for the return of their land, which had been taken immediately at the conclusion of the Revolutionary War. And I won't read the entire letter because it's a little lengthier, but I'll go ahead and start midway through. You told us you could crush us to nothing, and you demanded from us a great country as the price of that peace, which you had offered us as if our want of strength had destroyed our rights. Our chiefs had felt your power and were unable to contend against you, and they therefore gave up that country. What they agreed to has bound our nation, but your anger against us must by this time be cooled. And although our strength is not increased, nor your power become less, we ask you to consider calmly, were the terms dictated to us by your commissioners reasonable and just? Father, you have said that we were in your hand and that by closing it you could crush us to nothing. Are you determined to crush us? If you are, tell us so, that those of our nation who have become your children and have determined to die so may know what to do. In this case, one chief has said he would ask you to put him out of his pain. Another, who will not think of dying by the hand of his father or his brother, has said he will retire to the Chautauqua, eat of the fatal root, and sleep with his fathers in peace. All of the land we have been speaking of belonged to the 6 nations. No part of it ever belonged to the King of England, and he could not give it to you. Hear us once more. At Fort Stanwix, we agreed to deliver up those of our people who should do you any wrong, and that you might try them and punish them according to your law. We delivered up 2 men accordingly, but instead of trying them according to your law, The lowest of your people took them from your magistrate and put them immediately to death. It is just to punish the murder with death, but the Senecas will not deliver up their people to men who disregard the treaties of their own nation. Again, I still want to acknowledge that there's a divide both in time and in direct experience that prevents us from fully comprehending the context of this letter, but it was one of the documents that I was reading and thinking about the origins of the US presidency, and it struck me that it would be meaningful to share a little of it today. Washington continued to reject virtually all efforts by Indigenous peoples to exercise any agency or to maintain any sovereignty under colonial occupation. The letter from 3 Seneca chiefs painfully expresses some portion or some small portion of the experience of colonial destruction and helps give us some context for why US presidents have been understood as terrible figures and have been named town destroyers. In the present day, we can understand that those presidents who've asserted the belief that they have the right and ability to take any power they can seize through the use of violent force resonate powerfully with the history of the US presidency. In other words, violent domination is, in historical context, very presidential. As we've heard many media commentators commenting on the violent assault on the US Capitol on January 6th by saying, "This is not who we are," it's helpful to explore US history in order to recognize that at its roots, the US presidency has repeatedly been a locus of destruction. This is not to suggest that every elected leader will have to embrace this legacy in the vein of George Washington, but rather that to note that the foundations of the US presidency has been shaped by violent destruction, and that those foundations have not as yet been fundamentally changed or accounted for. So I mentioned to our audience last week that we would be learning a little bit this week about executive orders and how to make sense of researching them. So for our Zoom audience, I want to invite you here. I'll actually put a link in the chat for you. And what we're going to do, and I'll talk our podcast audience through this as well, we're going to look at how is it that we find and locate a executive order. So those who are following along directly, you can go to www.federalregister.gov. And this again is the register, or the Office of the Federal Register for the US government. When you visit this website, one of the options that you will see takes you to presidential documents. You can take a second to look over the different options that you see here. And if you look in the current issue, you'll see 3 presidential documents, and they'll show you the brand newest ones, which of course are coming out from Joseph Biden. When I look, I see that the new ones are about American Heart Month, National Black History Month, and National Teen Dating Violence Awareness and Prevention Month. But we can also look for executive orders. And for our Zoom audience, you can also simply Google Federal Register executive orders as well, and for our podcast audience, if you would like to do that. So the publication of executive orders in the Federal Register dates back to 1994. So it was a practice that began under the Clinton administration. And it allows us to see every executive order and other proclamations that are issued by the US presidency. Now I'm next going to suggest, let's see. So there are a few ways to get into executive orders, but I'll go ahead and share a direct link for those who are in the chat, and for our podcast audience. Again, what you can do is go to federalregister.gov, presidential-documents/executive-orders, or you can also just Google Federal Register executive orders. So when you go to this link, you're going to see that the executive orders back through the year 1994, 2 years into the Clinton presidency, are all available online. You'll see 254 from Bill Clinton between 1994 and the end of his presidency in January of 2001, another 276 from Barack Obama. These were both two-term presidents. We see that Donald Trump issued 220 just in his one term, and that Joe Biden has already issued 28 executive orders, and these don't count proclamations, just actual orders, most of which came out immediately on the first day of his presidency. So I'm going to go ahead and look at some of the orders from Donald Trump, and his most prolific year was in 2020. And we can scroll down and see some of the things that he did. He adjusted rates of pay. He issued some executive orders about savings bonds, school choices, federal civic architecture. He wanted beautiful architecture, apparently. State foreign assistance, and I'm going to scroll down to one that he issued in September, and it was titled Combating Race and Sex Stereotyping. And this is Executive Order 13950, and it was issued on September 22nd of 2020. So one of the things that I was curious to see when I first looked at this executive order is in the legacy of the presidency as it was rooted in a racial genocide, a genocide of indigenous peoples. I wanted to see, what's the contemporary response to thinking about racism. So the title of this executive order is titled Combating Race and Sex Stereotyping, and it, in section 2, gives us a number of definitions of what that entails. First, it tells us that there's such a thing as divisive concepts. Divisive concepts is quoted. And it gives us a list of concepts that fall under the definition of divisive concepts. So I'm not going to read all of them, but I'm going to start with number 2 under section A2, which says a divisive concept includes the United States is fundamentally racist or sexist. That's number 2. Number 3, an individual by virtue of his or her race or sex is inherently racist, sexist, or oppressive, whether consciously or unconsciously. 7, an individual by virtue of his or her race or sex bears responsibility for actions committed in the past by other members of the same race or sex. 8, any individual should feel discomfort, guilt, anguish, or any other form of psychological distress on account of his or her race or sex. Or 9, meritocracy or traits such as hard work ethic are racist or sexist or were created by a particular race to oppress others. To oppress another race. In addition, section 2 says that the term divisive concepts also includes any other form of race or sex stereotyping or any other form of race or sex scapegoating. And then section C tells us a definition of what race or sex scapegoating is. And it says race or sex scapegoating means assigning fault, blame, or bias to a race or sex or to members of a race or sex because of their race or sex. It similarly encompasses any claim that consciously or unconsciously and by virtue of his or her race or sex, members of any race are inherently racist or are inherently inclined to oppress others, or that members of a sex are inherently sexist or inclined to oppress others. Then this executive order goes on to instruct how the order will be put into place by restricting government agencies for engaging and in any training that might reinforce any of these divisive concepts, and by restricting any government contractors or anyone seeking a federal grant from training or educating in ways that would reinforce these, as Trump put it, divisive concepts. So this was essentially put immediately into effect shortly after it was issued. I believe it was issued on September 22nd. It went into effect on September 28th of this past year. And I have not yet read all of the 28 orders issued thus far by President Joseph Biden, but I've taken a good look at those that appear to be relevant. And thus far, this executive order has not been revoked. So it continues to be in effect in governing government contractors. And it's a really interesting one to think about as we sort of try to contemplate what does it mean to account for the historical roots of white supremacy and of colonization as one of the foundations of the US government when making sense of contemporary presidencies. And I don't necessarily dispute the notion that we should, for instance, not encourage people to wallow in blame or shame or anguish on any basis. And I also think it's complicated to talk about whether people are inherently oppressive or bear responsibility for actions committed in the past with people who share their identities or demographic categories. But I thought this was a really interesting order from the perspective of contemplating, is the United States executive branch grappling with its past in a helpful way? And I won't try to answer that question. I want to sort of leave it to the audience to contemplate. And again, Donald Trump is only one president, but as yet, this is an executive order that remains in effect. So we have a couple more things to do during our primary curriculum today. One is I'm going to share a book recommendation. So our recommendation for the week is an edited collection, an anthology by Paula Gunn Allen. That's Paula Gunn Allen, and Gunn is spelled with 2 N's. And the title of the book is Spider-Woman's Granddaughters, Traditional Tales and Contemporary Writing by Native American Women. And for those of you in our Zoom audience, I've also put the book reference into the chat in case you would like to save it. In addition, for those who are returning, you know that each week we feature some trivia questions under the title of Civics Trivia, or Civ Triv. So I'm going to screen share with our Zoom audience, but I'll still read everything for our podcast audience, and we'll start that now. So our trivia for the week. Let's begin. Our first question: in the past century, which US president has received the lowest approval rating? Now note that we don't have approval ratings from, for instance, the 19th century, because the kinds of polling that could be completed using quasi-contemporary technologies, of course, were not available at the time. So our earliest versions of, for instance, the Gallup poll and its equivalent go back less than 100 years. So pretty close. We're getting there now. We have more than 80 years of polling data. So what we're really looking at are these recent years. And the first choice is A, Richard Nixon, B, Donald Trump, C, Harry Truman, D, George W. Bush, or E, none of the above. And despite the current controversies over Donald Trump, he actually never dropped as low as the other 3. The correct answer in this case is C, Harry Truman. Though it was very close. His lowest approval rating was 22%. And he was closely followed by Richard Nixon, who dipped down at his lowest point to 24%. And then to George W. Bush. And George W. Bush was one of the widest ranging in his approval ratings. He hit 90% just about a week after, or a little over a week after September 11th. And then by the time of the end of his second term, he had dropped from 90 all the way down to 25%. Now note that some polls collect both approval and disapproval ratings, and those can be different. So this question focused on approval ratings. If we focused on greatest disapproval, the winner would actually be George W. Bush, who at one point, I believe, had a 71% disapproval rating. Though I'd have to check that statistic. So question 2, which of the following is not a presidential power? A, to enforce laws. B, to propose new laws. C, to allocate the use of federal funding. D, to appoint ambassadors. Or E, none of the above. And the correct answer on this one, and for our Zoom audience, of course, you're welcome to put your answers in the chat if you would like. The correct answer is C, to allocate the use of federal funding. With very, very small exceptions, the executive branch does not control budgets. Those have to go through Congress. This does not mean that the executive branch has no input or impact on the question of budgets, because, of course, any legislation passed by Congress still has to be signed into the law by the presidency unless the Congress is able to overcome a presidential veto. But the president can enforce laws, for instance, through the different offices of the executive branch, like the Department of Justice, or through the National Guard. The president can also propose new laws directly to Congress, and the president can appoint ambassadors. So the one power that the president here does not have is to allocate the use of federal funding. The president has some input, but ultimate control over the allocation of federal funding lies with the legislative branch, with the US Congress, which we'll learn about next week. Third question, has any US president ever served more than 2 terms? Answer choice A, no. The Constitution has always limited presidential terms to a maximum of 2. B, yes, but only Franklin Delano Roosevelt. C, yes, both Franklin Delano Roosevelt and Grover Cleveland. Or D, yes, but only Grover Cleveland. And the right answer choice on this one is B, only Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And the reason this was possible is that until the 22nd Amendment to the Constitution was passed after the death of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, FDR, there were no term limits for US presidents. George Washington had chosen to serve only 2 terms. And it became an unwritten tradition that presidents would serve 2 terms. And until FDR, no one else, to my knowledge, ever tried to run for or secure a 3rd term. But Franklin Delano Roosevelt ran for and won a 3rd term, which he completed, and ran again and won for a 4th term, but died shortly after his 4th term began. And the rest of his term was actually finished by, as I recall, Harry Truman. Shortly after FDR's death, Congress decided they should establish presidential term limits. And they initiated that, I believe, 2 years after his death, and then it took about 4 years to go through the process of ratification of a constitutional amendment by the state legislatures, which for those who joined us last week, takes a 2/3 support from all of the state legislatures. I'm sorry, 3/4 support from all of the state legislatures in order to pass the constitutional amendment. And so the 22nd Amendment was added to the Bill of Rights and therefore limited presidential term limits to 2. So since FDR, no one again has tried, though President Trump did mention the possibility that he wanted to see if that could be changed. So for our Zoom audience, I'm adding some links for future learning about presidential approval statistics, about presidential powers, and about FDR and the 22nd Amendment to the Constitution. And I want to really thank everybody who's been listening so far, and thank our podcast audience for tuning in. You can check out our events registration page at repair-events.eventbrite.com to see what's coming up. Next week, on Saturday, February 13th of 2021, we'll be meeting to learn a little bit more about the US Congress. And then the following Sunday, February 21st, we'll be convening to talk about impeachment. I also shared last week that we have added a monthly film screening and discussion to the Civics Project offerings, and that will be on the last Wednesday of each month at 4 p.m. Pacific Time, 7 p.m. Eastern Time, and our first film is scheduled for Wednesday, February 24th of 2021, and the film we'll be screening is Suppressed 2020, The Fight to Vote, which focuses mostly on voter suppression in the state of Georgia. So I hope to see many of you again. Thank you for tuning in and joining us. And for our Zoom audience, we'll have some live discussion now.